Welcome to this episode of Behind the Docs, presented by Evan Guthrie Law Firm. I'm attorney Evan Guthrie, and today we'll be reviewing a lawsuit against NBA player Draymond Green. And this is a complaint for damages that allege assault, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress by Jermaine Edmondson and Bianca Williams. And this was filed in the Alameda County, California court in July 2017, and it's in results to a July 2016 incident that happened in Michigan. And it's alleging that the defendants are Draymond Green and John Doe's 1 through 25. So it's just part of his entourage, or sort of unidentified individuals, are the John Does. And then this case was brought forward by attorney Lisa Bloom, and she's known as a sort of a high-profile lawyer that handles sort of celebrity clients again, or celebrity defendants, and known for holding press conferences. So some of the language in here in this complaint might be a little bit more colorful. And again, remember, this is just a complaint, so everything alleged in here is not necessarily proven to be true. It's just that a complaint, and then the defendant answers the complaint with what they deny or admit. So it's just the first part of sort of the process of filing a lawsuit and just moving forward with it. So we'll get into some of the high points. So sort of the introduction sort of goes right at Draymond Green. It's just sort of a hard introduction. It just flat out calls him a bully. Sort of just alleging he's a bully. And on the basketball court, he is famous for hitting players in the groin, kicking violently, and feigning shock every time a foul is called against him. And then it says, off the court, he drinks excessively, lashes out at reporters and other athletes on social media, and continues to complain about being overlooked in the first round of the 2012 NBA draft. So it just really gets at him there pretty hard, as far as saying that on the court he's a bully, and off the court he's a bully, and just saying there's no really difference to his on-court personality or demeanor and his off-court personality and demeanor. He's sort of the same person on and off the court. And then it sort of talks about his sort of a chip on his shoulder being overlooked in the first round of the 2012 NBA draft. And famously, he can recite every single player that was picked ahead of him until he was finally picked in the second round. That was sort of his motivating factor. But this is sort of alleging that he's sort of always perpetually angry, and that anger sort of carries over to incidents that happen off the court. And it says that his anger management problem recently victimized two innocent people, a young man and a woman, who were demeaned, assaulted, and choked. When the man told Mr. Green that violence against women took things too far, Mr. Green responded by hitting him in the face. Mr. Green never apologized for these incidents, which caused his victim to be shunned, ostracized, and targets of a celebrity athlete. Their lives have been forever changed. This lawsuit seeks accountability for Mr. Green's vicious bullying, physical assault, and violence against the women. So the plaintiffs, Jermaine Edmondson and Bianca Williams, allege as follows. So it just sort of introduces the parties who's involved in the lawsuit. So Jermaine Edmondson and Bianca Williams are both residents of the state of Michigan. And defendant Draymond Green is an individual all times here, a professional basketball player employed by the Golden State Warriors. And he resides in Berkeley, California. And his place of business is in Oakland, California. And it just says that at all times alleged in the complaint, defendant Draymond Green was the agent, employer, principal, partner, and co-conspirator of third parties acting as his, quote, entourage and bodyguards who committed some of the assaults against plaintiffs and alleged below. And these parties were all time acting in the course and scope of said relationship. And Mr. Green was fully aware of the conduct of third parties and authorized, ratified, and approve their acts, and is therefore vicariously liable for the damages caused by their conduct. So it's just saying that whatever Draymond's bodyguards did on his behalf, that Draymond is personally liable for their actions or any injuries or sort of assaults or anything else caused by them. And it says the true names and capacities of whether individual, corporate, or associate, or otherwise, the defendant Doe's 1 through 25, also unknown to the plaintiff this time, therefore sue said defendants by such fictitious names. And then when the true names and capacities of said defendants are ascertained, plaintiff will seek leave of the court to amend this complaint. So it's just saying that they don't know who those sort of people are in his entourage. So easily, it's since Draymond Green is sort of a celebrity, it's kind of easy to say who he is, but his entourage is not as famous as him, and they can't really say who they are. So probably after some investigation, if they find out some discovery or who these people are, they can amend the complaint and add them as sort of co-defendants. And then plaintiff is informed and believed that alleges that each defendant designated herein as Doe is responsible in the same manner for each other's defendant's acts, omissions, and for resulting injuries and damages to plaintiff as alleged herein. So it's just saying that anything that of Draymond Green's co-defendants did, that he's also responsible for, and vice versa. And then venue. So it says venue is proper because defendant Green is employed in Oakland and resides with his family in Berkeley in the county of Alameda. So it's just since the main sort of focus of the event was in Michigan, the sort of defendants live in, or the plaintiffs both live in Michigan, and the incident happened in Michigan. That might be the one choice for venue, but venue here was filed because the defendant Draymond Green, he works in Oakland and for Golden State Warriors, and resides with family in Berkeley, which is both in the county of Alameda. So that's where strategy was involved in bringing the venue to California, whether it be the laws or just they think they might get a better trial or better results. That's going to be sort of a choice of venue that they chose California instead of Michigan. And then going to sort of the background factual allegations, it just talks about how Jermaine Edmondson was a football player on a football scholarship, but how much he loved Michigan State University. It was the right school. It was a good fit. And then he got a full scholarship to play football in fall of 2012, and he's sort of in the middle of his football career when this incident happened, and that he was really enjoyed his time at Michigan State, and really into the school spirit throughout their lives. And then the other co-plaintiff, Bianca Williams, is a talented singer and scholar who enrolled at Michigan State University in the fall of 2013. And then it's going to tie Draymond to Michigan State, where he's an alumnus and he's a professional basketball player for the NBA Golden State Warriors. And then it talks about a little bit about Draymond's background. He garnered a nasty reputation for kicking and striking opposing players. He's labeled a, quote, dangerous player, and maneuvers, quote, much more violent in nature than other players. He's been fined, ejected, and suspended from games for his violent outbursts. So it's just kind of laying out sort of his violent past as an NBA player. And then they kind of contrast it here with some of his off-the-court stuff, where it's saying that it talks about how he gave $3.1 million to Michigan State University for the Draymond Green Strength and Conditioning Center, and then a scholarship endowment. And then how he shot a 2016 video for NBA's Lean In Together campaign, talking about how important it is to lean in and support the women in their lives. So it's just kind of contrasting some of the stuff he did off the court that were positive, that may have been sort of trying to mask some of his tendencies on and off the court. And then it kind of ties into the spring of 2016. So this happened July 2016, and sort of the incidents that may have played into his mindset before that time. And it talks about how he was fined for $25,000 after he kicked an opposing player in the groin twice. And then in June of 2016, it talks about how he was fined $129,644 for hitting an opposing player in the groin, which was sort of the incident with LeBron James that may have cost the Warriors the NBA championship, where they were able to come back and beat the Golden State Warriors 3-1 deficit, which had never happened before. And then probably just always goes to his mindset of how he was feeling at the time. In less than 1 month, the Warriors' frustrating defeat, 2016, Mr. Green and Emerson encountered Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams in the hostile and vicious version of Mr. Green, and not the phony version he'd been trying to project off the court. So they're trying to go to sort of his mindset that this was the real Draymond Green that they encountered, and not the one that's going to do sort of PSAs about protecting women and working with women, or donating and being sort of a really good member of the Michigan State community. So now it just goes to the July 8th, 2016 attack. And then it talks about sort of right after the Game 7 loss to the Cleveland Cavs that Mr. Green traveled to East Lansing to attend the wedding of former Michigan State classmate Denzel Drone that happened just about 2.5 weeks later. So they're trying to say that he was still sort of upset about that loss, and then it sort of carried over to his traveling to Michigan. And then on Friday, July 2016, the night before the wedding, Draymond went to Rick's American Cafe in East Lansing, along with two men who were also groomsmen. And then they were also both tall and large with black beards, and followed him around all night like bodyguards, like sort of his entourage, and they were protecting him. And it says Mr. Green was in a foul mood and at one point, grabbed another patron's phone and threw it on the ground when he tried to take a picture. So it kind of spills out another incident that happened a little bit prior to his encounter with Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams. And then it talks about how they were both there celebrating Mr. Edmondson's birthday around the same weekend. And then they were also on Rick's on Friday night. And at the end of the night, Miss Williams walked toward the exit while Mr. Edmondson stopped to chat with a former teammate. So he's a football player. He's talking to another football player. And then Draymond allegedly walked by with his bodyguards and bumped into Mr. Edmondson in the process. And Mr. Edmondson turned to Mr. Green and says, "You can at least say excuse me." So, and then allegedly Mr. Green looked at Edmondson, his teammate, and asked in reference, "Who the F is this?" And then as Mr. Edmondson replied, Mr. Green says, "I know, like you, I pay for, like you, scholarships." So then it says Mr. Green turned around and said something to two men behind him, that his, quote, bodyguards, and on information and belief, Mr. Green instructed them either implicitly or explicitly to attack Mr. Edmondson. So it's kind of, they got into this altercation where somebody gets bumped into, something is said, and then offense may or may not be taken. And then allegedly Draymond whispers something to the two guys that are in his entourage, it might be his bodyguards, and then at that point they sort of spring into action. And then all of a sudden two men grabbed Mr. Edmondson and pushed him up against the wall, and they were both bigger than him, and together they held him against the wall and choked him so that he could not move. Mr. Green did nothing to stop the attack, so he was just kind of just watching it and didn't really nothing to stop it or say don't stop, don't do that. So kind of leads to the belief that he sort of ordered the attack, where he was not surprised by their actions. And then all of a sudden the two men grabbed Mr. Edmondson, pushed him against the wall, and they held him against the wall and choked him so he could not move. Again, he didn't do anything to stop the attack. And Mrs. Williams, who was by the exit, heard the commotion and saw the two men choking Mr. Edmondson. She tried to get to him and scream, "Please stop, that's my boyfriend." And then one of the men turned around and says, "I don't give a who he is," and grabbed her by the neck. He pushed her by the neck into the wall. Mr. Green did not do anything to stop this vicious attack on a 21-year-old woman conducted on his behalf and right in front of him. So again, it's just alleging that he not only ordered the attack on Mr. Edmondson, which also resulted in sort of an attack on also Mrs. Williams was also a victim of the attack ordered by Mr. Green. So as a result of the order of attack on Mr. Edmondson, he pushed her back by the neck into the wall, and then again, Mr. Edmondson heard Miss Williams crying and calling for him. He got loose and ran over to her. Miss Williams was hurt and stunned. Instead of retaliating or escalating the situation, Mr. Edmondson stayed by her side and tried to soothe her. She was terrified that Mr. Green and the other men would come back. Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams left Rick's together. So again, they were just sort of stunned what sort of transpired at that point and really couldn't do too much. And then outside, Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams saw him running away, Mr. Draymond running away. And then not only that, but they alleged that he was laughing. And the choking attack was sort of characterized as shocking, disturbing, and offensive. Mr. Edmondson felt humiliated that he was attacked in front of his girlfriend and former teammate. And then he was also humiliated by Draymond referencing his scholarship, sort of belittling his scholarship that he paid for it. And he believed that Mr. Green's donation did not give him the right to grade students on scholarship at MSU. But more than anything, he wanted to support Mrs. Williams, who was hurt and scared. So Miss Williams cried on and off all night, starting at a young age, she witnessed years of her mother being abused by a man. Feeling a man's hands around her neck brought her back horrifying memories in which she used to hide under the bed and listening to the attacks, imagining what her mother was going to. So it just sort of flashed back to previous incidents of violence in her life, and just goes to emotional distress that she suffered as a result of the situation with Mr. Green. So the next sort of night, into the next night, there was another attack that's sort of detailed here in the complaint. And then this is the July 2010 attack. Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams talked to their friends about the attack and supported their friends. They decided not to cancel Mr. Edmondson's birthday plans the next night because they knew Mr. Green would be at the wedding. So they thought it's okay for them to go out. He's going to be at this wedding. It's safe, and we can just go out and just have fun and enjoy the birthday celebration. So next night they went out, and then the early morning into the July 10th, 2016, so it'd be early Sunday morning at that point, they both went to Conrad's Grill, which was a late-night food place that you kind of go to afterwards to get something to eat after going out. And then after they ordered food, Draymond entered the restaurant and got in line at the food counter, and then he was alone. When he saw Mrs. Williams, he got out of the line and walked towards her. He stopped a few feet in front of her, making sure that she saw him as he looked her up and down, leering at her, and then he smirked. So it was kind of saying that he went out of his way to sort of intimidate her afterwards, knowing that she was the one that his entourage attacked the night before. And then Miss Williams was scared and nervous about what Mr. Green would do, given that the night before his entourage had physically attacked her at his behest. She froze. Mr. Edmondson, who walked outside before he saw Mr. Green, entered Conrad's, went to the door and called out to Miss Williams. Both he and Miss Williams walked outside, and shortly after, Miss Draymond walked outside too. Seeing that the mood was calm, so it was kind of a calm situation, Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams approached Mr. Green to make peace. So they kind of went up to him, and it was their turn to sort of speak out. And Mr. Edmondson knew that Miss Williams was still upset about what had happened, and he wanted her to feel safe again. So he took the turn to confront Draymond and said, "Last night did not have to happen. My girl got choked. That wasn't cool." So he said that to Draymond. And then at that point, Draymond allegedly started poking Mr. Edmondson in the shoulder goadingly, which means kind of like, what are you going to do now type things. Mr. Edmondson told him that there was no need to get physical. In response, Mr. Green hit Mr. Edmondson in the face. Mr. Edmondson grabbed his face and reeled backwards, stunned in pain. He spat out blood. Miss Williams, who was standing right to next to Mr. Edmondson, was stunned, shocked, and yet again terrified of Mr. Green. And then the hit emitted a loud slap or smack sound. It would be expected for any football players at the scene to run to their teammate's defense, but because Mr. Edmondson had been hit by Draymond Green, no one did anything. This was humiliating for Mr. Edmondson. So kind of setting the scene that everybody was sort of just staying around, just sort of shocked. And after the slap, it was so loud that nobody really did anything. They were just scared to act or didn't really come to his defense. And just like the previous night, they say that Draymond just ran away at that point. And then police who were patrolling the area said they heard the slap and approached and found him trying to sneak out the side exit from Conrad's, and then they arrested him. So apparently Draymond slapped him so hard that everybody in this near vicinity was able to hear it, and even the police heard it. They said, "What was that?" And they were able to sort of find Draymond and arrest him. And one of Draymond's friends showed up at the scene and tried to talk to Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams, and again maybe try to diffuse the situation, make it go away, and then it kind of they didn't want to hear it, and then they sort of went at home. So then it kind of details Draymond's attempt to silence Mr. Edmondson, so whatever the aftermath is of his attempt to do that. So Draymond was arrested and charged with assault and battery, and at the jail, Draymond was smiling and looking happy, so it kind of goes to his demeanor. He displayed an arrogant grin in his mugshot, and the police administered a preliminary breath test, which revealed a .10 blood alcohol content above the legal limit, and they held him in jail until he sobered up. So again, that's kind of the blood alcohol is more for driving than sort of walking around. But again, he took the blood tests, and then again just sort of held him until he was able to get sobered up. And then it says, not understanding how seriously Mr. Edmondson takes violence against women, Mr. Green embarked on a campaign to try to bribe, influence, intimidate, or threaten witnesses, including Mr. Edmondson. Upon information and belief, Mr. Green instructed his friends to try to buy Mr. Edmondson's silence. And one of Mr. Green's close friends texted Mr. Edmondson on July 10th, writing, "Hey bro, don't press charges. Please talk today. He will give you bread. Let's meet, bro." So you can imagine that just Mr. Edmondson kind of releasing these texts and then sort of making an offer of sort of a cash settlement to make it go away. And it says Mr. Edmondson did not respond. Later in the day, which was Mr. Edmondson's birthday, so that Sunday, another one of Mr. Green's friends told Mr. Edmondson that Mr. Green said he would pay Mr. Edmondson if he did not press charges. Mr. Edmondson received a text message that says, "Don't press no charges." That said, "I'll cut you a check." So it's just kind of saying that, relaying sort of an offer to make the everything go away type message. And then on around July 11th, 2016, James Hios, Draymond's attorney, told Mr. Edmondson over the phone to keep your mouth shut, and instructed Mr. Edmondson himself to keep his mouth shut. So it's kind of reaching out to his friend and then Mr. Edmondson himself to sort of, I don't know if it's necessarily a threat, but just sort of telling him to keep your mouth shut and don't talk type things. And then later on it says that Draymond released to the press that my legal team is handling it and be resolved quickly. When things happen, just meet them head on. So he's kind of just downplaying the incident to the press, or there was possibly investigating the incident. And then on around July 28th, 2016, about 2.5 weeks later after the incident, Mr. Green accepted a deal that was issued a citation on a lesser charge. So he was able to sort of plea out and make the legal situation go away. But then it talks about the aftermath. So news spread quickly around campus that Mr. Green had been arrested at Conrad's and that Mr. Edmondson was the complaining party. So you can imagine sort of a college town that word can spread pretty quickly. And then someone that's maybe a private person, there's all of a sudden there's sort of get a little bit more notice and a little bit more attention. And Mr. Edmondson and Mr. Williams were harassed on a daily basis, both on social media posts that they shared about their birthday. They were bombarded with insults from students who had heard about the attack, making fun of Mr. Edmondson for getting slapped by Mr. Green and telling Miss Williams that your boyfriend's so it's kind of they were getting humiliating sort of social media posts and sort of getting harassed. And then Mr. Edmondson's name was released to the press on July 11th, 2016. And then once Mr. Edmondson's name was released by the press, he and Miss Williams were heckled by strangers about the assault online and in person. They did not feel unsafe on campus. So it's just saying that wherever their lives were ruined and it wasn't the same after just for being involved in this incident that they were victims of. Mr. Green's arrest garnered so much attention that other celebrities made public statements about the arrest and saying that, again, it's just saying that really there wasn't anything that was done by either the Golden State Warriors or by anybody else at that point. And then it says, due to concerns about safety on campus, Mr. Edmondson and his family decided that it'd be best if he sort of transferred out of Michigan State. And then he did so at that time. And then when Miss Williams, it says that she was also harassed during her sort of senior year at Michigan State University. And again, she was made fun of. Again, it had a sort of a hard time on that. And then it talks about how Mr. Edmondson tried to transfer out of Michigan State, but wasn't able to find eligibility in another school, so he went back. And again, he was just sort of a constant victim of harassment and ridicule on campus. And then he was able to graduate in 2017. And then this goes on to whatever chances he had to make it to the NFL were is tarnished by the Mr. Green assault. So whenever he did a pro day, which is kind of a workout you do at a school in front of pro scouts, the NFL DraftScouts.com notes read, Edmondson in the center of the Draymond Green assault arrest. So he had more notoriety for his involvement in that incident than he did for his football skills. So it kind of overshadowed whatever football skills he did have. And then even after he entered a plea deal in his criminal case, Mr. Green refused to take responsibility for hitting Mr. Edmondson and failed to speak out against the violence against women at that point. In fact, he told a reporter in October 2016 that he wouldn't change anything about that summer. It says Mr. Green's refusal to acknowledge the true facts and apologize compounded to the ostracism and public humiliation of Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams that continues to date. And it calls Mr. Green a hypocrite. And it says the Lean In Together campaign is part of the Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In initiative, which seeks to empower women. Though the Lean In partnership with the NBA highlights and creates videos featuring particular players they believe epitomize what it means to lean in and support the women in their lives. Mr. Edmondson was doing exactly that when he stood up to Mr. Green without violence to tell him that was wrong and that he and his friends choked Miss Williams. And Mr. Green's response to Mr. Edmondson's real-life off-screen attempt to lean in was to hit him in the face. So it kind of contrasts the supposed image of Draymond by leaning in and supporting women with what actually happened. And then after a violence against women by his entourage, that when confronted, he slapped Mr. Edmondson in the face. So it's just sort of the opposite of what image that they're alleging there. So the first cause of action, again, this is going to be the assault part. And then it's just saying that the defendants acted in an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact to plaintiffs and to assault plaintiffs. And plaintiffs reasonably believed that they were about to be touched in a harmful or offensive manner. So that goes kind of to the assault part. And plaintiffs did not consent. And then Mr. Green gave authority to his entourage to act on his behalf in transactions with third parties, and including physical interactions with patrons at Rick's. So again, it's just saying that he sort of ordered the assault at that point. And then just goes over sort of the as a direct and proximate cause of the defendant's actions herein, plaintiffs have suffered and continue to suffer harm, and telling the damages and amount to be proven at trial. Harm includes the shock and emotional stress of being publicly threatened and attacked by celebrated sports star, financial hardship, wage losses, humiliation, mental and physical pain, harm to reputation, nervousness, grief, anxiety, worry, mortification, indignity, embarrassment, apprehension, other damages, and amounts to be proven at trial, such as saying that sort of what they suffered as a result of Mr. Green. And defendant's conduct was willful, malicious, oppressive, and wanton. Defendants acted in knowing disregard for plaintiff's rights and safety with awareness of the probable consequences of his conduct. Plaintiffs suffered humiliation and outrage. And again, it just suffers, or sort of defendant's acts constitute oppression, fraud, and malicious and malice under the California Civil Code. So it just cites the California Civil Code there. The second cause of action, which is battery, so that's the actual touching of doing that. So it just says incorporate by reference the facts set in, and then it talks about how his entourage agreed to batter Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams at Rick's, and then Mr. Green was aware this entourage planned to batter Mr. Edmondson and Miss Williams at Rick's, and Mr. Green agreed with his entourage that they intended the battery to be committed. And it just talks about how he knew that the battery was being committed, and then they didn't consent to the touching. And then it talks about just some of the damages that they did, and it talks about the California Civil Code for battery. And then the third cause of action is the intentional infliction of emotional distress. So again, it's just saying that they continue to suffer severe physical, emotional, physical distress, psychological distress. And as a direct and proximate cause of Mr. Green's actions, plaintiffs have suffered and will continue to suffer pain, suffering, extreme and severe mental anguish, and emotional distress, including harm to reputation. Mr. Edmondson has suffered and will continue to suffer a loss of earnings and employment benefits to his job opportunities. Defendant's conduct was malicious and oppressive, and plaintiffs are entitled to punitive damages in amount determined at trial. As a famous athlete who was both revered and reviled for his violent antics on the court, Mr. Green's off-court antics are likewise subject to intense public scrutiny. Mr. Edmondson's name was dragged through the mud because Mr. Green intentionally tried to engage him in a brawl, even though Mr. Edmondson's response was beyond reproach. Mr. Green's conduct toward Mr. Edmondson and Mr. Williams exposed plaintiffs to intense suffering, anguish, and nervousness, grief, anxiety, worry, shock, humiliation, and shame. Mr. Edmondson has been exposed to intense public scorn with harassment, ridiculing him for being slapped, and berating him for having Mr. Green arrested. Almost 1 year after the attack, he still plays back the assault in his head over and over again, wondering how it happened so fast and his life changed so drastically. It's still hard for him to sleep, and when he does, he sometimes wakes up crying. So it just talks about some of the, again, sort of the mental state he's in the aftermath of the incident. So again, this is the prayer for relief. So this is the part of the complaint where, again, it kind of tells what they want. So general damages, the amount to be determined to be proved at trial. Past, future, and medical related expenses, the amount determined proof at trial. Past and future lost earnings. Impairment in earning capacity. Punitive damages, reasonable attorney's fees, fees pursuant to applicable law, prejudgment and post-judgment interest, and any other further relief. And then it just demands a jury trial. Again, the complaint stated July 25th, 2017 in doing that. So that's the complaint against Draymond Green. It definitely alleges a lot of different facts in doing that. And that's going to be the complaint. So thanks for listening today, and we'll see you next episode.